Hello everyone, I have some endgame puzzles that I compiled here. They all deal with different ideas and principles in the endgame, and they're all very important. So let's go into the first one. You're playing as white. For all of these, take some time and try to think about the solution, but let's go through this one. Now you always want to think about your objective, and here as white it's clearly to promote this pawn, which means that c7 is probably the first move you consider. But after c7, they can play the move rook c1 check. And after your king moves, let's say to b5, their rook is in a position where it will sacrifice itself on c8. It's essentially gotten to the c file, which means that black can now start focusing on making progress with their own pawn. And it's going to take you some time to actually promote this pawn, because you have to defend this square, so you'd have to do that with the rook most likely. But if you move the rook here, you lose the pawn immediately. So starting with king b6 makes sense. But then e4 comes, then you go rook a8, and then e3 comes. Then they can finally promote, but by this point you can just sacrifice and go e2. And what happened is, black has given up the rook, but they have a very dangerous pawn, and you're going to have to give away your rook back. And actually, you're going to find yourself in a losing position here. Because of this pawn majority that black has on the king side. And so for that reason, they're going to be able to promote this final pawn here and win the game, which is why going backwards, c7 doesn't work. You simply allow the rook to control this file, and they're going to push their pawn here, and at the right moment, sacrifice the rook for your queen. So instead of c7, another consideration is perhaps king b5, so then rook c1 doesn't come with check, but this doesn't work either because, well, they can maybe still go rook c1 and, simply, again, push their pawn, and once you build up the ability to promote, you can simply sacrifice and we reach a very similar position, but perhaps even simpler is they can just give you checks here. And after like king a6 check, king b6 check, if you ever want to escape, you go to c7 and now you're blocking your own pawn, so then they can go e5 and now start to push here. So that would be one way to deal with that. But again, eventually their idea would be to sacrifice the rook, which is why you have to deal with this idea. You have to stop it. And the only way to stop this idea of rook c1 is to go rook to a3, which is the solution here. The point is, after the king moves, let's say to g4, you can now push your pawn to c7. And the difference is, after they go rook c1 check, you don't move away your king, but you block rook c3. This is, I believe, called building a bridge, but the general idea is that you're stopping this rook from having access to the promotion square, so it would eventually be able to sacrifice. You're getting in the way of this rook. Of course, if they trade, well, then you're completely winning here. You still should double check. Let's say they had these three pawns connected and maybe a bishop as well. There are cases where that material, if it works together, could be able to, promote together, and maybe it would be a draw. But for the most part, if you make a queen, you're probably going to win. And so this idea of rook a3 is, of course, simply to stop this rook from having access to c8. Now, another thing to note is that you are very close to promoting. There are cases where the rook would be able to use another square to guard c8. So for example, the rook might have been able to go to d8 if the pawn was farther back. But of course that's not here, and here the only option is to go rook c1, which is why it's important that you stopped it with rook c3. So that was a solution for the first puzzle. Quickly, you might be thinking, you might have found this idea of taking here with check, and you might be thinking, because it's check, can I do it? But the answer is no, because after the king moves, the king is guarding f3. So now you have no way to control the third rank with your rook, which means that, once you push your pawn, they're going to be able to go rook c1. You're not going to be able to then match that with rook c3. So that would not work. So that was the first position, introducing the idea of coming from behind and stopping your opponent's rook. So always keep that in mind, that sometimes the most valuable squares are behind the king here when you're looking to promote. Moving on to puzzle number 2, it is here you're actually playing as black, and white just took the pawn on h5. So in this position, like I said, it's black to move. So again, take some time and try to find the solution. Now, typically a queen against a queen, sometimes even if the other side has an extra pawn, is often a draw. Because whenever you try to make any progress, your opponent will just start checking you over and over again along the entire board, and you're not going to be able to escape those checks. However, here it's a very special case because the kings are very different. Your king is very active, their king is very stuck here in a very lonely position, and that actually allows for the solution. Now you need to start by looking at checks, and rook b4 doesn't achieve anything. The king can simply move, so you have to go rook b1. Sorry, queen b1 or queen b4. And when going queen b1, you only leave white with one option, queen d1. Now here you might have saw this idea of queen b4 check, and this is definitely the most intuitive continuation because it's a check, but actually it doesn't lead anywhere. The king can simply move, and even though you might think that the king is kind of in a corner here, there's nothing you can do again because whenever you try to make progress, they're going to give you a check. So for example, let's say you go for queen f4 check, they move, you give a check, they move, and now you play king f4 looking to make progress and do a checkmate. Well, there we go. That was the moment that they can start striking back and just giving you checks over and over again. And similarly, if you try to go queen c4, a very similar thing would happen. Eventually, after these checks, you're going to have to move your king in closer because you can't checkmate with just a queen. So once you need to move your king in closer to make progress, they're just going to give you a check on any number of squares. And that is essentially when you've lost any ability to do a checkmate, which is why, going back here, you can't continue with queen b4. Now, the solution is this really beautiful queen b2 idea. The idea is, of course, to give a checkmate on f2. And if the king moves, you have checkmate. If instead the queen moves anywhere else, well, you have checkmate on e2. And the important thing is that the queen has no checks. Any of these checks you take, the check on d3 you take, on b3 you take with the queen, on f3, and very importantly, c1 is also covered, which is why if you went to a2 instead, the difference is they would have queen c1, the only drawing move. So you have to go to b2 to keep control over c1, and they've run out of moves. They're just going to have to move their queen somewhere, and you can deliver. In this case, you don't want to go to e2 because they would take it, but you can go to d2 and then to f2. And so the idea here essentially is to understand that it's important in very open positions to control as many squares as you can. So here, what's the difference between these two moves? Well, b2 simply controls more squares that are critical, specifically the c1 square. So whenever you're comparing moves on an open board in an endgame position, whether it's rooks, whether it's queens, even bishops, go to the square that controls more territory because most likely that will help you a lot. So this was a really clever idea, and it also shows that sometimes you can win when it's a queen against a queen. For puzzle 3, it is white to move after black just took the knight on e6, and you want to look at your objective like you did in the previous puzzles. And here, the only clear objective is to promote this pawn. If you manage to promote the pawn and make a queen, you probably would win the game. So then you kind of need to think, how can I promote this pawn? Well, if you start by just going a7, it doesn't work that well in view of a rook to a2. And now you can't promote because they will take your pawn here. And, you can try to defend the pawn in one way with bishop to b8 or maybe bishop to d4. But regardless, at the very least, they can sacrifice the rook for the pawn, and with a simple bishop, you can't win. So this would, the move a7 would give you no winning chances. So instead, you need to think a bit more out of the box, and you need to prepare pushing your pawn, but you want to do that in a way that would not allow him to have any contact with the pawn. It would not allow him to sacrifice the rook for the pawn. And that leads you to the move king to b3, stopping the rook from coming to a2. And he can still try, or she, black, can still try many ideas here. And so you have to be prepared for all of them. The first one is to just give you some checks, back and forth. Luckily, your bishop on e5 covers that square. The second one is to go rook to g7, and, well, once you go a7, take that pawn. But again, this bishop on e5 can cover that square as well. Another idea that is pretty obvious is this move rook to g1, going to a1, and stopping you from promoting. But you can simply go a7, and after rook to a1, once again, this monster bishop here, you can simply take the rook here. And then there's really just a couple more ideas. The first one is to go rook to g5, but here you can ignore this bishop, and you have to be able to, make some sacrifices to reach your greater goal. So you have to be comfortable to just push your pawn here. Give away the bishop, but it doesn't matter because you go a8, you make a queen, and you're going to be able to win this game. And then the final tricky idea that they have actually is after king b3 to go king d7 or f7, but the idea is after you go a7 to go rook g8 and stop this a8 square. And now you need to employ a super clever idea. And the idea is bishop to b8. Again, the bishop being the VIP here, just guarding all of these diagonals. So the idea with bishop to b8 is that if they were to take your bishop, of course, you promote. That's obvious. And if they don't do it, you're clearing way for your pawn to go to a8 without the rook being able to take it. You're essentially intercepting the a8 square with the g8 square. So whatever they do, you can promote next move. So just a really super clever idea. Here is puzzle number 4, white to move again, and you're in check this time, so your moves are truly limited here. You actually just have 3 possible moves: blocking with the bishop, with the knight, or moving your king to d5. So let's start with moving the king to d5. Here, you need to realize that they can play the move knight e7, defending their rook, attacking your king, and you don't have that many squares. The rook actually guards here, and you really have only this kind of path over here. So you have to go king d4, then they can just give a check on f5. If you go back while you're repeating and you don't want to repeat here, you can win this game. And, let's say you don't go back, let's say you go king to d3, well, at the very least, they can go king d7. And what has happened here? Well, their pieces have gone from being pretty passive here, kind of on this back row and kind of not really working together and aggressive, to, in just a couple of moves, being super aggressive and kind of in your face. And what does that lead to? Well, at the very least, they can sacrifice here, and this is just a complete draw with this material here. So moving your king essentially does not lead to winning chances for you. Instead, you might be looking at moving the bishop to d6. However, there's also the move knight d6. Now you might be wondering, what's the difference? Well, if they end up trading everything here and sacrificing the rook for the piece, there's no difference. You end in this position where you're just going to be able to promote and you're going to be able to win. The key is, though, if you move your knight to d6 check, they take with their knight, you take with the bishop, they won't take here, and instead just make a waiting move, rook c2, for example. And you can't make any progress here. If you ever try to go, well, firstly, note that you can't really ever make progress by trying to promote this pawn, because you can't get your king in here. So you might want to take this pawn, but when you go king f6, they go rook c6, and they come back to the square. And because of this pin here, you're going to end up losing your bishop. If you take this pawn, you have to come back. If you go to e5, they can actually, come in. So probably king e6, and now we're just repeating moves. So basically, there's no way for you to make progress after they go rook c2 here, because you can't make progress with this pawn, and you can't really do anything over here because immediately they can strike and pin your bishop. So for that reason, you want to actually take with your bishop instead. Now, or you want to block with your bishop instead. Now, what is the point? Well, after they take with the knight, you take here, and the difference is this comes with check. They have to move their king, and now you can come in, and you can immediately promote, but also importantly, you can even just go like rook or king d7 here. Although promoting is, of course, the most easy way here because the knight guards the queen here, and after takes, you're in a completely winning position. Let's say they go king g7, where they have no way to attack your pawn. You're just going to be able to, at some point, pick up this pawn, promote, and win the game. So just the idea here to realize is the difference when you end up having the rook here, the pawns here, the kings here, and if you have a bishop here or a knight here, once they trade the knight for the piece that you first moved. And you just have to figure out which one is better, and the knight is better because it comes with check and allows you to promote here because it supports c8. So this was kind of a position where you simply compare your options, and you need to think deeply about the lines and what really are the differences. And for puzzle number 5, king d3 is played here as black and you're playing as white. What do you do? Well, this is a pretty forcing puzzle here, because your first move is to go b7. You need to make some counterplay if your entire, if the entire time all you do is try to go after this pawn, they're going to be able to continue attacking, and you're not going to be able to counterattack. You need to start immediately and do some counterplay. So b7. Now they have to take. If they don't, you're going to be able to promote. So takes. Now they go c3. So far, it's a pretty easy puzzle. I mean, b7 is a very intuitive move. But after they go c3, sorry, not b3, after they go c3, you need to consider taking, because of course, if you don't take, they're going to be able to maybe just run this pawn down here. So the first consideration is, should I take? But after you take, their king is really close to your pawn, and you have to play this perfectly to not lose. If you go like king a6, then suddenly you lose after king b4, and they take the pawn. You actually have to play king c6, and then go king d5, and wrap around here, and you end up in this drawn position. And for that reason, you need to be very careful here, and you don't want to take the knight, or you don't want to take with the knight the pawn. Instead, you play the move knight a3, and this is the key idea of this puzzle. What does this do? Well, it makes it so after they push and takes, the difference is before their king was here, now their king is on c2. And now you can simply go here, pick up this pawn, and of course just promote here. And so you had to be able to essentially push back their pawn one square. If they don't push their pawn and maybe just move their king, well, this does nothing for them. You're simply just going to take their pawn. So their best shot is indeed to push here and look to remove your knight. But again, the pawn now is down the board, and before their king was here, now it's on c2, and that makes all the difference. So those were some very instructive endgame positions that are, very common and just really important things that you should know when it comes time for the endgame. Let me know also down below if you enjoyed this type of video where I kind of combined 5 puzzles into one, or if you prefer opening videos or other videos. Just let me know down below what you prefer to see. Subscribe if you want more content like this. Like this video if you enjoy it, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.